This episode is sponsored by DreamHost, web hosting with purpose. Visit dreamhost.com/Climify to sign up for a hosting plan today. I'm Eric Benson, the host of Climify, and I've been a satisfied DreamHost user since 2006. And I'm not the only one who enjoys DreamHost. They are PC Mag's Editor's Choice winner 5 years in a row. I use DreamHost because they're affordable, they care about the planet, they're easy to use, and have fantastic customer service. In fact, it's 24/7. I can't tell you how many times I've messed up the back end of my WordPress site, only to be saved by a DreamHost technician within the next 15 minutes or less. They're always available on chat. They send me links to tutorials, but most often just fix the site themselves. And then, voila, it's back up within a few minutes. DreamHost customer service is seriously the best. Because I care about the planet, I also want a hosting service that does too. DreamHost has improved on their corporate sustainability since I joined up 16 years ago. Currently, they get their electricity from renewable sources, use high-efficiency cooling infrastructure, utilize power-efficient processors, and partner with in-state clean wind programs. I also love how DreamHost is employee-owned and have office sustainability initiatives. DreamHost is committed to their employees and to their customers. Plus, their affiliate program is really cool. You can earn $15 to $200 in commission just for referring a friend who sets up a new account. Even better, DreamHost has no limits on how many people you refer to the program. To sign up as a DreamHost affiliate, go to dreamhost.com/affiliates. That's dreamhost.com/affiliates. And just click the sign up today button. And if you want to learn more about their sustainability initiatives, head to dreamhost.com and click on the green hosting link on the bottom.
Welcome to Climify, the podcast that connects climate scientists and design educators together so that we can help combat our climate crisis in our classrooms. The discussions on this program are geared to help you climify your syllabi to assign projects that not only teach design fundamentals, but also can have a positive impact on our climate.
My name is Brooke Havlik, and I'm a communications strategist working with nonprofits, philanthropy, and business to strengthen their climate and human rights communication. I live in New York City, and you can follow me at brookehavlik.com or on Twitter and LinkedIn at Brooke Havlik.
I know I said we wouldn't have an episode this week, but as COP27 is in Egypt in a few days, I found a bit of time to put this episode with Brooke Havlik together, just for you. Throughout this season, we've woven in to every episode the question, how do we better tell climate stories? This is what Brooke does for a living. She's a great person to cap off our last individual interview this season, sharing the best strategies to communicate climate action to a community and how she thinks we need to rebrand the telling of our collective climate future. Brooke, well, welcome to Climify. It's an honor to have you on the program. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. How's it over there? You're in New York, right?
I am, and yeah, it's the end of October, early November, and it's 70 degrees in New York City, which is pretty scary. That it's this warm right now in New York, and I've heard that from around the world too.
Yeah, a friend of mine who's around the New York area said she's had a LinkedIn post where it was her in a tank top saying this is not right for October.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it feels it's a strange morning. I also woke up and read the UN report this morning that countries aren't on track right now to meet the climate goals. So definitely thinking about both that kind of personal local experience and then the global news cycle right now.
Yeah, well, some sobering news to start the day for sure. I read that same report, and I'm hoping our conversation is a little bit more uplifting as with things that we can do.
Yes.
So what led you to getting involved in the work that you're doing, and why climate?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think particularly, I work in climate communications and
Yes.
and I work with media a lot. And so only a couple of years ago, I think I realized why I decided to work kind of on the public relations or communication side. And I realized that when I was thinking about a childhood story that my mom told me a lot. My mom was kind of the person who was like the letter writer. She taught me how to write a letter to the editor when I was
Yeah.
10 years old if I was mad about something
Did
or
you do
wanting to.
that?
I did.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. But she always told a story about my grandfather, white working class, lower class, man growing up in the 60s and 70s, and she was a product of that time as
Mhm.
well. And he didn't have views that I agree with, right? He was misogynistic, a little bit racist.
Yeah, that's no good.
And yeah, but the story of a lot of white men throughout our history, right? And white people, right? These are things that
Yep.
we know to be true. And she told me a story about how the news would come on at night, and she'd be sitting with her dad. And because she was being exposed to the media and she was being exposed to things her friends were saying or culture around her,
Mhm.
she had a really different viewpoint than her father. And
Yeah.
my grandmother would get so mad that they were fighting so hard about what was happening in the country at that time. Of
Wow.
course, it was a very turbulent time during Vietnam and the civil rights
Yeah.
movement, that she'd come in and unplug the television to stop them from fighting. And to me, that was like a really interesting childhood narrative that the media shaped my mother's viewpoints enough to change her mind on something that she could have replicated.
Mhm.
Um, so, I think over the years, we've seen how important communications design is to like shaping our worldview.
Yeah.
And for a long, long time, certain groups of people have had the power to shape that, whether it's you work in an advertising agency, you are working as a journalist, or whatever it might be, or in the creative industry, theater, movies, all of these things. And really only in the last probably 5, 10 years has there been a shakeup in that. And
Yeah.
I see myself as, and what led me to this, to working in media, is that you need people to be pushing that from the inside and to be
Yeah.
changing how things are done. And I think we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like with climate over the last
Yeah, I want
10,
to
20
because
years but it really it shapes now where I've been and the types of jobs I've had and opportunities.
yeah, in a future episode, I talked to some of my current students, already recorded, and they talked about the same thing about there's a need for people to be in the system as much as there needs to be people outside of the system pushing it. And so that's what you're doing. You're inside in the media.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the PR industry in general has had an extremely powerful, um, position
Yeah,
to be able to both enable fossil fuel companies to continue
I
to kind
know.
of get out scotch free, but also it's had a powerful position in starting to change people's perspectives. And,
Mhm.
of course, journalists are independent and they do their research and things like that. But the public relations industry is quite powerful in helping shape what gets on the news and what happens and what people see and how that shapes their worldview too.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. And one of the reasons why I invited you on was to hear more about your experiences in shaping the conversation around climate and what your experiences were there, as well as what you found to be very effective in that world.
Hmm.
Yeah, so maybe you can start with just your experiences in working in this sphere and um, how it's been for you.
Yeah. So I've worked, across cultural institutions, public media, grassroots organizing, philanthropy, and business. And so I've really gotten the cool thing I think about being in comms or design or in these spaces is you can really move from different types of institutions, campaigns, projects, and really feel like where am I having the impact I want to have at that moment. And, especially for
Mhm.
young people, and also people teaching young people, I think this is a really important thing to experiment with. So I, worked at a cultural institution in Chicago called the Shed Aquarium,
Oh,
where
yes.
we
I'm a member of the Shed
Oh,
Aquarium.
awesome.
My
That was
family
my
is.
first job, and it was really interesting because I don't think I left school. I studied sociology and anthropology. I didn't leave school thinking, "Oh, this is exactly what I'm going to do." But while there, for several years, I realized the power of an institution like that. They
Mhm.
see millions of people every year. Adults, are, cultural institutions are one of the main ways they get education on really
Yeah.
important and critical issues, but also you have to speak to an incredibly wide audience. And so I
Mhm.
learned a lot there, both helping curate some museums that had some, climate information in them, but also digital content and things like that, to help share messages. And then I moved, I went to grad school for environmental sociology at University of Oregon, which was
Yeah.
incredibly
Eugene, Oregon.
Eugene, Oregon, exactly. Yeah. And I got to study with people who were studying law, and philosophy and design and architecture. And that was such an incredible experience because I started to look at climate and environmental issues
Yeah.
through so many different lenses. I was there to study it through race, class, gender, sexuality. But I think, sitting alongside people who were studying philosophy or poetry
Yeah.
really made me think about the issue in a different way, that it really is across the board and you're not just a quote unquote environmentalist or a quote unquote climate activist.
Yeah. They're all connected.
They're all connected and there's so many ways. And just because you're a designer doesn't mean that's the only way you approach the
Yeah. Yeah.
problem or
That's totally
solution.
true. Yeah. I think
Yes.
a lot of the designers feel like, well, I can make something and that'll help. But I think there's so many things that we can do just as citizens.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so then I transitioned. I went to public media. I worked at WGBH in Boston with this
Oh my
idea of like,
gosh.
yeah, how do
I
you
grew up on that, right?
that's awesome.
WGBH. Yeah.
Yes. A lot of good content
Yes.
from WGBH. Um, and so I worked for Nova, the science
Oh
documentary
man. Love
series.
Nova. Love it.
Yeah. And like worked with scientists, science communicators, thinking through how do you translate really complicated issues
Hmm.
to the wider public and particularly to young people within the science education field. And I love that, but I really, and I liked working in media, but I was really interested in being more on the kind of advocacy and
Yeah.
action side and political action. So I moved to
Hmm.
New York and started working at We Act for Environmental Justice as their second communications director. They had
Oh,
been
nice.
around for 30 plus years. And I trained under the incredible, well known environmental justice activist Peggy Shepard and the late Cecil Corbin Mark. And there I really
Wow.
learned,
Wow.
yeah, yeah, no,
Yeah. You
two
must have learned a lot from
powerhouses.
them. Yeah.
I did. I did. Yeah, I worked at the local and the state and the federal level on policy advocacy and using communications and media to push through certain campaigns around climate justice, around clean air.
Hmm.
Um, and it was just a really profound, important experience in my life, because I was able to also understand how do you organize people, which is again getting back to the question of like, how do you move people to make
Yeah.
the change you
How
want?
do you do that?
Well, I mean, there it's where I really learned it's not just about you or the
Mhm.
design or the news story. It's about the ecosystem of how you advocate for change,
Mhm.
whatever that, subcategory of climate you're working on. And so for me, it's about having a learning that there's coalitions and other people in the game with
Yeah.
you that can support you. And there's people in power where you have to, think about how to use their
Mhm.
levers at certain points and get them on your side. And so it's much more comprehensive and bigger than just whether I placed a news story or whether I
Yeah.
designed a good graphic, right, for them. And I think that was really profound for me to see how something moves from A to Z. And sometimes it moves from A to, D back to B.
Oh man, yeah.
And before you actually get a policy and one and a law changed.
So there has to be a lot more planning than just one particular thing, right? You have to have all these other things that happen around it or connected to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was working with our organizers who were, knocking on doors within, New York City Housing Authority or the public housing. I was working with, state legislators on materials that they needed, whether it was data or visuals for a
Wow.
speech and for legislation. It really, it's a whole gamut of um, strategy and planning that go into a campaign, and design and communications play such a central role in it, because it's not just about changing the public's opinion to get, a building electrification bill passed or climate bill passed. It's also it's really about whether the politician will do something about it, and
Yeah.
whether that design, communications, media strategy also supports the pressure for them to make change.
And some politicians listen better to that than others, I'm assuming.
That's right. But sometimes
That's an
you're loud
understatement.
enough
Likely,
that,
yeah.
yeah, sometimes you can be loud enough that they can't ignore you, which
Yeah,
is,
yeah, we got to do that more probably. Did you find, or do you have, I guess, a campaign or project that you worked on that your favorite, or one that you think just had like the most impact?
yeah. I mean, I think generally, when it comes to climate stories and campaigns, um, you know, we really have to think about how they have the power to move hearts and minds, and not just presenting facts straight up.
Yeah,
Um, and then I think, generally we just need more of them. There's a long legacy within media, and I say that quite generally, whether it's film, whether it's advertising, whether it's television, print media, broadcasts, of not enough reporting on both
sure.
the causes of climate change and the impact that it's having, and particularly right now, the solutions that are needed, the positive.
I agree on that.
And there were a lot of people who called the industry out on that, and I think things are really changing. There's a great group called Covering Climate Now that's pressuring media to tell more stories and better stories and stronger
Good.
stories about that. But for me, one project that I feel really proud of was when I was at WEACT. Um, I was there several years ago at this point, but we were noticing that in the communities, the environmental justice and climate justice communities in which we worked and organized in, that there was not a lot of good reporting and storytelling around what was happening with heat waves in the city. Obviously,
Mm,
New York City has the urban heat island effect.
yeah,
Temperatures are much hotter here than in Long Island or the Hamptons or
it's all
something.
that concrete.
So much concrete. And people live in old, old, old buildings. And so
Yeah,
a couple of us at WEACT, as well as teaming up with CUNY, which is the state college here, or the city college
yeah.
here in New York City, and then with a news outlet called Adapt New York, we partnered together with each other to do some research on what was happening inside of people's homes. So we defined the problem. We're
Yeah.
not seeing enough press on it. We're not seeing enough storytelling. And we need to design a solution for that. And so we worked with a couple of I'd say people who understood technology to
Yeah.
build these little monitors
Yeah.
that we put inside of community members' homes across New York City that the We Act worked with. And we, for a whole summer, measured what was happening inside of people's homes. So most of the
Mhm.
data we have from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and other like federal level data about heat is often what's happening at the street level and not what's happening inside
Yeah,
of people's homes. So this is where we had a we in our design process we thought we're going to find data that shows there's a lot of injustice happening across the city.
I'm sure.
So we put them in people's homes, we measured it, and then we partnered with WNYC, the NPR station here in New York City, to air weekly episodes about heat and how heat was impacting people across the city. And then we eventually started reporting on the data we were getting, which was really cool. We collaborated to visualize through sound what it looks like to have an apartment in New
Through
York City where you
sound.
don't have air conditioning and
Oh,
how hot
wow.
it gets. So how the pitch of
That's
the
wild.
yeah, the music would show you how hot it would get at certain points of day and that it would stay the same at
Wow.
night, which is when it's most dangerous, particularly to people who have
How did you
asthma
guys think
or
about
elderly.
that? Like, I would never, I guess my first thought would not go to sound. So how did you get there?
Well, yeah, I mean, WNYC is audio, so you have
There you go.
millions of listeners across the city, including very important policymakers who might not have had this on their radar.
Hmm.
And so we were thinking about how challenging it would be to communicate that I think the average temperature homes without air conditioners were somewhere around like 82 degrees at
Jeez.
night. But that
Wow.
doesn't, I mean, it's hot, but you don't know until you hear it. That through audio that it is pretty heightened at night compared to someone's
Yeah.
house who has air conditioning. So
Wow. That was
yeah,
smart.
and yeah, but I feel really proud of that because that wouldn't have just happened out of thin air, right? You had to figure out the problem,
Mhm.
design, research, and then think of how to communicate it.
Yeah. In terms of you mentioned something about moving hearts and minds a minute ago, and I'm wondering what you have found. And I guess it may not be a silver bullet, but what has been moving hearts and minds that you've seen from, I guess, the storytelling perspective?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about the stories that need to be told, it's more about and what actually moves people from a communication standpoint. I go straight to what is the strategy. So I think for a long time we've been kind of focusing on generally like we need to convince people.
Right.
People don't believe this. You have to use hope, not fear.
Hmm.
These are kind of common things we're hearing now about climate communications
Yeah, I hear those all
design
the time. Yeah.
all the time. And I think for me, as a comm strategist, there's no specific strategy for everyone, right? We're
Yeah.
never going to move the
That's what I've been
whole
also
public.
hearing. Yeah.
Yes.
And it makes
Um,
sense. Makes total sense.
yeah, I definitely recommend checking out Yale Climate Communications. They do
Oh,
a lot of
sure.
amazing research on audiences and who you're actually speaking to. And they break down by category, like people who are alarmed all the way to like people who are dismissive.
Hmm.
And I think as climate communications has refined and advanced over time, we have to be more niche about how we target campaigns.
Yeah.
So thinking about who we're trying to the audience, who we're trying to influence, what do we want them to know, how do what and why do they need to change, and who do they listen to, who are the messengers. And so when we want to move hearts and minds, sure, we can produce a multi-million dollar blockbuster Hollywood film and say we've moved lots of minds, or we can be more specific. Are you working on a campaign or trying to move people in Pennsylvania to vote for a climate representative and not one who's a climate denier? Well, that's a
Hmm.
really specific strategy about how to move hearts
Yeah.
and minds using climate as a potential lever. Are you are you working in the solar industry as a designer and you need more homeowners to make the switch? Maybe talking about climate isn't actually what's going to move their hearts and
Yeah.
minds,
I've
it's
also heard
their
that.
dollar.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that actually to get to the point of your question, like how do we move hearts and minds? It's about being strategic and
Hmm.
knowing what you want out of it. And then we can figure out whether we actually accomplished it. And so that's how I think, and I think a lot of people who work in the communications field think about issues and problems.
Yeah. And so do designers, right? I mean, we have to
Mhm.
know our audience, but I think maybe from maybe a design educator or just designer who wants to do more, they might not have at their in their general knowledge base all the audience information that you mentioned Yale does. So now they might because we're telling them, right? This is a
Mhm.
good way to, if you're wanting to do this kind of stuff in your classroom, knowing the audience is, number one if you want to have that communication.
Yeah, and there's just so many resources out there now to get that information, and you don't have to do original polling, and you also don't have to make like assumptions about who those people are. I
Hmm.
think there's just so many polling groups or research, that I would really recommend instructors and students to look for and to kind of stretch out of the boundaries of design because the amount that is going into fixing the positive here, like the amount of people, the sheer amount of people who are working on climate and who are smart and brilliant and shifting out of other industries they might have been in or moving their research in this way is just it's truly astounding to me and it's pretty
Well,
cool
that's good to
actually.
hear. I think
Yeah.
from maybe, even though I'm connected and are I'm very involved with climate action, climate justice, and I follow a lot of people on Twitter and LinkedIn. I don't really know, or I can't really see that there's like that so many people that you described. That makes me feel better because
Yeah.
I'm in this little bubble. I think, and that bubble is it's growing every day, but that just makes me feel better. So thank you.
Yeah. But I think it's also like when you open the climate sections of any news outlet, it is
Mhm.
really dark. It
Yeah,
feels really dark. And I think, you know, I I think it's realistic, if not
yeah, sure.
denying that these things are happening. And I think that's a really important we have to hold two truths at one time, which is,
Yeah, that's
I
important.
struggle with my own like emotions and mental health around what's happening
Oh,
around
yeah.
us. And I think it's holding the truth of things are bad. And, people are experiencing it all over the world in different ways, probably worse than 70 degrees in November in New York City. Um,
Yeah.
and at the same time, you know, solar energy is the cheapest form of energy that exists, right? That
Yeah,
happens
hooray, right?
rapidly
This
and
is
like
good.
celebrating those things. And I think that's also a role of climate and design folks is to really be able to hold both of those truths, not choose one or the other, hope or fear. It's both. I mean, there's
Mhm.
scary stuff, but there's also a lot of incredible things happening.
Yeah, the climate anxiety thing is a big deal, and for a lot of people, including myself. And I remember talking to someone about it in counseling, and I was, I think, trying to rationalize it. Like my anxiety about this isn't as bad as someone actually going through the maybe not necessarily the worst case scenario, but maybe from the climate perspective. And her response as well, there's two truths. You can still be anxious about it and acknowledge that, but not, but also understand that it's you're lucky too.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think, you know, not that we're in a post-COVID world, but people
I
are out and
know.
about more. And I
That's
think we
true.
know that like one of the ways is to feel better, just generally, is to, be around other people. There is when you're only reading the news, and I've gone down this like, you know, bubble myself of
Yeah.
just consuming the negative. And I think joining movements, joining, groups who are organizing on any issue. Like I just recently joined this group called Clean Creatives in New York City, and it's
Oh,
an
that sounds
incredible
cool.
group that people should check out. And they're working through a really smart campaigning to get people in the creative advertising and PR industries to stop their companies and the industry from working with fossil fuels. There's still like
Yeah.
230 PR and creative companies who are working with fossil fuel companies and allowing them to continue greenwashing and to soften or
Yeah.
mislead or misinform the public. So, that's a really cool way, like that maybe not everyone's thinking of, but is so powerful. It's like the tobacco industry. It's like Mad Men, it's
You need
all of
that
that.
community.
Yeah. And so like there's events in New York City and there's, more popping up across the country. And that's like a very clear strategic way. If you're in this field, you can get involved.
Yeah, the clean creatives need to meet the climate designers group, right?
Yeah, that's a
There's
good idea. Maybe
yeah, we need to
connect.
organize that.
Exactly.
I'll need your help. What stories? One of the things that we're talking about this season, one of a couple of things is what stories need to be told better in
Mhm.
the climate world, and how can designers or creatives help? And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on those two questions.
Yeah. I mean, I have kind of two answers, and they're a bit like regionally based. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine.
So I didn't the kind of end of my journey as a professional as I worked a lot on human rights globally, where climate intersected. It intersects on so many levels,
Hmm.
those two issues. And so one thing, working across media and narrative and storytelling is I think we need to be better about being honest and truthful with our audiences about what's happening around the world in a lot
Yeah,
of countries and the scale of kind of the global injustice. I mean, we're seeing massive flooding in Nigeria,
yeah,
Pakistan, Vietnam, obviously Florida, like
yeah.
just such grave injustice. And it feels, and I'm not actually sure I have the answer for this audience, but I'm more so challenging this idea. And I've traveled a fair amount, and when I go to other countries, I feel like people are so much more tapped into what's happening compared to Americans. And that's news cycle. That might be what they see on TV. I don't know, but I think the story, and it leads to really what's happening at COP, in November is
In Egypt,
these
right?
countries, yeah, in Egypt is like the big UN climate conferences that a lot of countries around the world are desperately asking for more help. And I don't think, like design or communications is going to solve it, but I do think it creates, you know, those two things shape our worldview. And if our
Hmm.
worldview doesn't see this as an extremely unjust um, global issue, I think we're not going to be as connected to it to understand how to solve it as well. And I think a lot of what we read in the media or see in the news is so American focused
It
that
is.
thinking, and what does that mean? That might mean language, it might mean visuals that you represent, it might be data that you're using, really kind of questioning yourself. And when I started to work on human rights globally, that really it pushed me a little bit further. So I think that, and then like what's happening at the state or local level again
Hmm.
doesn't it's not as top of mind, and the stories aren't being told the way they need to be because it's just so hyper local. And I think there's both positives and negatives that are happening, but it's also a really good way to tap into as a designer, as a communicator, with what's happening at the county level or in your state elections that are really going to affect whether New York or Illinois or Texas are able to support larger American goals
Yeah,
around climate.
yeah. I spoke to a friend of mine, John Jennings, an earlier episode, and his response was, unfortunately, a lot of people aren't going to care until it happens to them,
Mhm.
right? And so I'm wondering, based on those two answers, that if we focus probably first on the local, regional, especially when there is kind of these unfortunate, like we just saw with Hurricane Ian in Florida, that when it happens to them, they'll also be more empathetic to what's going on in Pakistan or Nigeria or anywhere. And I'm
Mhm.
wondering if what your thoughts are about that kind of strategy.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think, based on the data, we know that most people know that climate change is happening, and the
Yeah.
majority know that it's anthropogenic or human caused. And so I think it's more about like connecting the dots. I mean, yeah, it's 70 degrees in November. The leaves aren't changing in the same way. How do we like
Mhm.
visualize that and connect it to the farmer in Nebraska who's experiencing flooding, or the family in California who had to leave their home because of wildfires? And I think that
Yeah.
is a really interesting maybe design challenge, is like, how do you connect people? Of course, like how people are experiencing it is unequal, and the timing might be different for different people, but there's some humanity in people, talking about it at least. And I think
Yeah.
that's really one of the struggles. And when you look at the data, it shows most people aren't actually just talking about it. They might be reading it. But I mean, I'll be frank, I don't sit at the dinner table every night and talk to my husband about that stuff. It's hard.
Well,
Um,
sometimes depressing too, right?
it's depressing, right? But, I think the more people hear a balance of those stories and they see both opportunities to get involved locally, whether it's resiliency efforts or local policy, I think, and then connecting them to what's happening across the country, we will find that we have, more in common than difference. I
Yeah.
think at the global level, that's a challenge, which I would love to, really hear from your students or other
I
people's
know,
students,
yeah.
because it is, unless, it's another step and another boundary beyond what people might be experiencing at the local level. But I think it really, really matters. And as far as storytelling and empathy and um, human lives, and what they're
Yeah, I totally
experiencing.
agree. Well, good thing is that the episode after yours is an interview with my students. So
Oh, cool.
you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and you can hear what they have to say. And um, I think it won't necessarily surprise you, but I think some of it might.
Mm,
And maybe
mm.
it'd be helpful for you.
No, the young people are or young, I don't even know how old they are, but generally young people are my
I never
inspiration,
ask.
and and are incredible how brilliant and creative and
Mhm.
organized they really are in order to get stuff done.
Oh yeah.
So cool.
Yeah, that's why I'm in teaching because when I was in industry for a while, and then I was in grad school and I was a TA, and I remember being a TA in one of these classes with a professor, and I just felt all the energy in the room
Mm,
where I was working in corporate America, and I mean the energy was there, but it was like in pockets, and I'd walk through, and people just kind of going throughout their day,
mhm,
and they would say things like, "Is it Friday yet?" And then
mm.
like maybe this isn't the right place for me to work when
Yeah.
they're not bringing that energy. And this, I would say, the students don't always bring the same energy. But in general, like it's super interesting to be
Mhm,
there.
mhm.
So
Well, and I think that gets kind of back to my career of like moving from different spaces, and this idea that if you are in this field, and even if you want to work in climate and design, try different spaces, because like what gives you that energy to keep going? Like, it's not an easy choice to say, I want to dedicate my time, my life, my profession to this really hard, complex thing. And so, like, use your skills where you feel like you're doing your best. And that took me probably a long time to like
yeah.
learn as a professional that, there are places where you just decide you're making a lot of impact and you have the energy to really put in that life force. And then
Hmm.
other places might not. And so, that's part of the professional journey, I think, but an important one.
Yeah. And you're in a new space. You're in a consulting space now. How is that? And then what kind of groups are you working with there?
Yeah, so I'm working as a consultant mostly with climate nonprofits, some philanthropy, and also some climate tech businesses, and all under the, you know umbrella that they're working to make impact. And I think it's pretty cool. It's challenging, but I get to produce a lot. And I think, as creatives, generally, that's what we want to be doing. We want to be putting stuff out into the world and really seeing the impact of it. So it's a great experience. And I really, I think I've been working for a bit, let's say
Yeah.
my age, but so, and I am taking a lot of skills that I've learned over time, but I've also seen like young people who are consultants that are really inspiring too, that are like taking this on because we live in just a
Good.
different professional life. And I think that's exciting for them. But I would say the number one most important thing for me to be successful in this was relationships. And I feel
Mm.
like we don't talk about that enough within movements, within professions,
Or
that
network.
like network. And it's not just like I write you a letter, so then you write me one. It's like, how are you? How's your
Mhm.
parents? Like,
Yeah.
oh, did you move? What's the new house like? It's not just that very transactional like
Yeah.
LinkedIn like. It's really knowing people and them seeing you do good work and then, wanting to hire you. But that's a huge part. And that's, how I work with media and things like that as well, is just keeping relationships alive. And it helps in the long run with, being more successful at whatever you're doing, but particularly if you're trying to make impact on different,
Yeah.
justice or climate issues.
I totally agree with that because I think your network is one where it can be purely transactional and you don't really then know the person. And then they
Hmm.
expect that sort of transaction and it's not
Right.
like humanity. It's not,
Right.
that sort of that personal reflection and touch that you get from truly caring about how your friend is doing.
Yeah. It's really, I mean, I don't know. I think it's something I had in me the whole time, but I really learned it at WeAct when they were trying
Oh,
to
okay.
organize people. And, like all these digital kind of campaign apps, I'm sure everyone gets like the vote for X and, you get all
Oh,
these
yeah.
text messages and you're like, I don't want this. I didn't sign up for
Especially
this.
now. Yes.
Why do you know my name and all this stuff? And the model at WeAct, which I think is long term more effective to get people to do things and to like move power and create power, is relationships. And so I would
Hmm.
listen to the organizers sit in our organizing office and be like, oh, is your grandma out of the hospital? And oh, can I do anything? Can I bring something over? And it takes a lot more work, but like I'm not answering those text messages because I have no
Yeah.
affinity
Me
for those.
either.
So versus like people who come to every meeting and show up at City Hall.
Mhm.
And I think that's just a really, so like one thing I think about is you can organize online, but you got to organize in communities as well, and
Yeah.
know your community, whatever that community looks like.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And then I think, just like you said, I've just in my past career, that's how I kind of looked at networking in that way of how you doing, right?
Hmm.
And some of it was just accidental. Like that wasn't a strategy of mine. I wasn't like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm not going to be transactional in this conversation. It was just, I don't know. It wasn't something I thought about. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't know. Is that boasting? I don't know.
No, it's
No.
knowing your
Okay,
skill
good.
set.
Yeah, it's a skill I have. Put it on my
Yeah,
resume.
exactly.
Uh, well, another question we've been asking all season is about the branding of climate change, and I'm
Mm.
definitely interested in your response to this as someone who does this daily. Like, what do you think about how either organizations or the government or whoever it is has branded climate change and or climate action? And do we need to redo this? Do we need to rethink
Hmm.
it?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would kind of argue the opposite, that we need to rebrand who's responsible for the mess that we're
Ah,
in.
good one.
Um,
Agreed. Yes. Turn the
I mean,
tables.
yeah, and I mentioned we talked about this a little bit earlier, but yeah, for decades, the oil and gas industry and the advertising, the design industry have had a huge role in branding the real impacts of climate.
True.
There's a really good podcast that if folks haven't listened to, not to up another podcast, but
Hey, It's okay.
Drilled by Amy Westerfeld. She goes into kind of the history of how the creative industry has helped, supported, uplifted all the kind of like New York Mad Men
Hmm.
agencies helped shape this, just like they did with tobacco.
Oh
And
yeah.
and really, it resulted in the media then playing both sides of this, like juxtaposing climate science as equal to climate denialism, even though we
Right.
know that the vast majority for years we've known the consensus on that. And it stuck us in this like, we got to convince people phase, and we lost out on years where we could have been finding the solutions, right? And
Yeah.
and deploying the solutions and not having these political battles that we're having. So I see it as all interconnected, and people have made billions of dollars off of, you know, designing TV ads that make us think that gas is natural and that it's safe,
The
which is a
natural
whole thing.
gas.
And there's an Ellen DeGeneres. She did like a whole ad about it, right? Like there were celebrities involved in this, and so I think
You mean
the
pro
rebrand.
national natural gas?
It's an old ad from like the early 2000s,
Oh
late 90s.
no.
I'll see if I can send it to you. But celebrities were involved in this. It was a
Oh
whole
man.
industry that everything's safe and fine, and we're finding the solutions for you. And I think um, now we're reaping the consequences of that. So I think
True.
it doesn't always maybe come out enough. So it doesn't come out enough. Like who's to blame? And right now, I think it's happening more with oil and gas companies. The top five, I think, made something like $63 billion in this quarter. So
Yeah, I mean, the
four
gas
months.
prices have been very high and
All of that, and if we're like figuring out who to point the finger at, and not that there's just one finger, but I really think they're still getting off too easily. And so I
I
would
agree.
argue the rebrand needs to happen. And while they're simultaneously trying to convince us that they're going renewable, and they're part of creating a clean future, I think that's really something we need to target, because it's messy. It's not as fun, but it's really keeping oil and gas in the ground over the
Mhm.
next 10 years is one of the most fundamental things we need to
We
do
need to
to
do that.
stop climate change.
So stop pointing fingers at each other and point them at those 5 oil and gas companies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the Clean Creatives group is a really good group because it calls them out and
Mhm.
and shows, and it's almost like the Kanye effect right now,
Oh my
right? Like,
gosh.
just not to bring up like current news,
But
but he
still,
just
it's
lost
true.
like millions of dollars because Adidas
Yeah.
dropped him, right? And
Yeah,
so
he's no
it's
longer a
about
billionaire. He's no longer a billionaire.
exactly. I mean, that's about making people,
They
unsavory.
they care about money,
Basically.
so you gotta hit them there, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I did
Exactly. And I think design can have a huge, huge impact in that. I mean, even just the campaigns that were happening around Kanye for the last week really
worked well.
influenced that shift. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen the new, um, Jon Stewart show on Apple TV, but he
Mhm.
he interviewed the CEO of Shell.
Mm,
In typical Jon Stewart fashion, great follow-up questions, trying to undercut his BS, the CEO's
mhm,
BS. And it was a really tough conversation because that CEO had seemingly an answer for everything.
mhm,
And it's all was framed as it's not Shell's fault. It's the organization that represents the oil and gas industry. We're trying to become renewable,
mhm,
help others become renewable. And John was always like, I really like what, but there was no evidence either way that they were. And so
mhm,
John wasn't prepared for like fighting no evidence with no evidence. And
mhm,
it was a
mhm.
frustrating interview. I could tell for John Stewart because um, you weren't going to get through to the CEO.
Right. Right.
I
Well,
don't
and
think so.
he had people like me, but on the other side, equipped
Hmm.
for like thinking through what John would say to them. They probably watched hours of John's interviews and
Yeah.
said, "This is how he's going to approach you. This is how
Yep.
you respond." And so that's
I'm
why
sure.
it's important to place value and to fund and to support climate communication so that we can help people like John, and kind of fight the battle there a bit as well.
Well, also connected to Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert. I remember seeing in in line with your comment about rebranding, who's to blame. I saw, and I think it was Stephen Colbert. He said, "Let's have a debate about climate science on the show," and he brought in 98 people and then two on the opposing side. So he's like,
Mm,
"This is a fair debate,
mhm,
not one person for, one person against," and that
mm.
is really reframing and revisualizing what really the science is. And
Yeah,
I've always remembered that
it's
particular
powerful.
episode. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're running out of time here and coming up to my favorite question that I ask everyone. And you had this question ahead of time. So hopefully some time to really sink your teeth into it. But it's just turning the tables here. And you're now a design educator. You're asked to teach a design class. And so thinking about your work and your experience, what would you do if you were asked to teach a project or an entire class um, involving like climate communications?
Mm. Yeah, I would assign a project that's a bit of a choose your own adventure.
Oh, I like that.
I actually did teach when I was at University of Oregon
Oh,
and for
yeah.
a bit. So, giving people like 5 or 6 different problems, campaign, like that are potential that you could participate in. Maybe it's something with solar in California. Maybe it's building electrification in New York City. Maybe it's a recycling campaign
I like
in
this.
the South. You have a couple of different kind of campaigns or projects that you want to change something and either pass a law or whatever it might be, scenarios. And then students can decide like which one they want to work on. And then, they are designers that, like we talked about, they exist in an ecosystem where people are collaborating together. And so just test your boundaries, like try to build a strategy around communications and design and narrative of around how can you shift a certain audience's views on something. And who would you work with? And I think
Mhm.
that's a cool thing because it would allow students also to think about and research like who's working on electrifying buildings in New York State. And really get to know different organizations and kind of present that as a project of how they would go about that and how they would
Yeah,
measure whether they were successful or not with design, or with a media strategy or whatever they choose to do. And I think students don't get enough of those opportunities
that's true.
sometimes in classrooms to really do what you do in the workplace every day.
Mhm. Yeah.
um,
Yeah,
so
and I
yeah, if
like that.
anyone does that, I would love to see it in action.
Well, you're making me look pretty smart here because that's what I'm doing in my class this
Oh, that's
semester is
awesome.
yeah,
That's,
well, there's a bunch of different guests on the program have provided, like you, really interesting design projects. So I gave my students it's about a 4-week project where they can pick one of, I think, five different options, and they're all very different. And then they latch on to one because of its their values or their interests.
Mhm.
And I wish I knew about that Yale site beforehand, but
Mm,
now I do. I can make it better so that they can really understand the audiences more. So
yeah,
yeah, I'm on the same page as you. This makes me
great,
feel better about,
amazing,
my teaching skills this term.
amazing.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're great.
Yeah, thank you. So with that assignment too, thinking through it, in terms of you mentioned earlier on some resources besides Yale that I think would be pretty useful for the students with that kind of assignment. Maybe we can have an email afterwards to find out what they are, and I can share them on the
Sure,
show, unless you know them off the top of your head at the moment.
I got a list.
You got a list. Okay, well,
Yeah,
we'll share that then because I think that'd be really important to have as
yeah,
well with this to sort of provide the students with as much help as they can.
definitely.
Yeah. Well, it was a pleasure talking to you today, Brooke, and I really appreciate the work you're doing. You're not the TV star, but you're doing all the work necessary for them to communicate, and I really appreciate that. And I enjoyed looking through the work you've done on your website.
Thank you, Eric. It's been fun.
I wish you the best of luck in your consulting business. And where can we learn more about that and you online?
You can check out Brooke Havlik or find me on LinkedIn and Twitter at Brooke Havlik.
This podcast is written, produced, and engineered by me. Designed by Bashul Rashik and Mark O'Brien, with social media strategy by Michelle Wynn. Music by Casual Motive. Next time on Climify, we'll end our second season with 3 episodes, talking to design students and recent design graduates to learn more about what they want and need from us design educators when it comes to climate design in the classroom, so they can better turn that into a career creating positive change.
Thanks for listening to Climify. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. To catch all the latest on Climify, you can follow us on Instagram at Climify Podcast. Climify is part of Climate Designers. Learn more at climatedesigners.org/edu.